Hello, and welcome to today's lesson on the thoracic cage, pectoral girdle, and the upper limb for Honors Anatomy and Physiology at James Island Charter High School. So let's get started here. The thoracic cage. You have the thorax, that's what we call the chest, right? The bones of the thorax, though, we call that the thoracic cage. There are a few important elements here. We've got the thoracic vertebrae, that is T1 through T12. And there are 12 total pairs of ribs that match with each of these thoracic vertebrae. You have numbers 1 through 7. They are called true ribs because they attach directly to the sternum individually. Numbers 8 through 12, we call those false ribs. We call them false ribs because they attach indirectly or not at all to the sternum. Those two that don't attach at all to the sternum, we call those floating ribs. Those are numbers 11 through 12. They don't attach at all to the sternum, so we call them floating. You'll see why in a second. The sternum, that's known as the breastbone. It's the anterior side and in the midline of the body, and it's made up of 3 parts that we'll talk about. The manubrium, if you think manus, or in Spanish it's mano, it means hand. This goes back and it means handle. This is the most superior part of the sternum. You have the main part of the sternum that's called the body. And then you have the xiphoid process, which xyphos was a short sword back in the ancient Greek era. And this is the most inferior part. So let's take a look at this really quickly. So you see here are each of these ribs, and they articulate with one of the thoracic vertebrae in the back. You see the true ribs, numbers 1 through 7 here. You can see that they attach directly onto the sternum individually. That's 1 through 7. Then once they start attaching in groups like this, that's when we call them false ribs. Right? And then you see back here numbers 12 and number 11. They're actually floating. They do not attach to the sternum at all. So you have your true ribs and your false ribs, and in those false ribs you also have 2 floating ribs. You see here, this whole part right here is called the sternum. But this is called the manubrium. This is the body. And this is the xiphoid process. You can see it kind of looks like a handle to a short sword or something like that. When we refer to the ribs, we call that costal. So these in between each of the ribs, that's called the intercostal space. This is called the costal cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum. This is kind of an interesting picture too, where you can see how it actually lays out, where you have the sternum here resting on the heart. This is when you do CPR, the sternum is what you're pressing down on, and you'll actually hear some pretty awful crunching. That's this costal cartilage crunching underneath of that, but it's pressing on the heart to get blood flowing through primarily the aorta. You can also see where it rests right on the diaphragm. That rests right here on the xiphoid process, or it attaches right at the xiphoid process here. This is also a pretty good picture of the side. You can see a rib actually articulating with a vertebrae right here. I just thought it was a cool picture to include, not necessarily things that you need to have memorized for this quiz coming up, but you can see where you have the thoracic vertebrae and how that rib actually articulates on here. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the pectoral girdle. The main function of the pectoral girdle is to attach the upper limbs to the body trunk. There are 2 bones. There are also plenty of muscles, but since this is the skeleton unit, we'll talk about the bones. You have the clavicle, or the clavicles, since you have 2 of them. You'll see that right here. It's also known as the collarbone, but we'll call it the clavicle. That's on the anterior side. It's S-shaped. You can't really see it here, but if you look at it at a slightly different angle, you can see it's a little bit more curved. And that articulates with the manubrium. You can see that here on the sternum. So it articulates there, and then it also goes back to the scapula, which the scapula, it's also known as the shoulder blade. Again, we'll call that the scapula. That's on the posterior side. There are 4 structures that you need to know about this. You've got the coracoid process, which anchors the bicep. That's this guy right here. You can see the bicep comes down the humerus and anchors onto here. There's also the acromial process, also known as the acromion. which acros is the highest. Just remember that that's the highest part on the scapula. This articulates with the clavicle. That's the actual part. The acromioclavicular joint is what that's called. But just the acromion, or the acromial process, is all you need to know. You also have the glenoid cavity, which is right in here. With gleno means eyeball, and so oid is like, or similar to. So if you look, when we see on the other picture, you'll see that this kind of looks like the socket of an eyeball, which I guess is what anatomists were going with when they named it that. And that's what articulates with the humerus of the arm. You also see, you can't see it here, but it's on the posterior side. There's the spine of the scapula, and that is a prominence along the posterior. And that's what you can actually feel when you feel for your shoulder blade. You can actually feel the spine of your scapula. So let's take another look here. So you see, this is the anterior aspect of the right scapula. So you see the coracoid process. Again, that's where the bicep attaches on. You can see right there down the humerus. You have the glenoid cavity and the acromion, right? If you think this right here is the spine, you see that spine kind of culminates up here into the acromion, or the acromial process. Either of those is fine. And on the front is the coracoid process. Oh, there we go. Missed this one here. So this is a lateral view, the lateral aspect of the right scapula. And I thought this was kind of a fun diagram that might be a bit easier to remember. I don't need you to remember the infraspinous or the subscapular fossa. I don't need you to remember the fossa, fossae, I guess. But they're good to be able to locate yourself a little bit. So you see the supraspinous fossa. Supra means above, so it's the over spine fossa. It's the fossa over the spine. The infraspinous fossa. It's infra means below, so that's below, like infrared is below red on the visible spectrum. Infraspinous is the fossa that's below the spine. So you can see here the spine is on this side, which leads up to the acromion, and below that is the infraspinous fossa. Here you can see the glenoid cavity a bit better. That's where the humerus actually articulates into the scapula. Okay. You have the coracoid process again. That's where the bicep anchors onto. All right, now for the structure of the upper limb, there's a lot here, so brace yourself. All right. So when we're talking about the upper limb, there are very specific terms. I may even mistakenly mix them up because colloquially and anatomically, there's a little bit of variation. But when we're speaking anatomically, the arm is specifically between your shoulder and your elbow, whereas the forearm is everything between the elbow and the wrist, right? So just saying the arm is not necessarily correct if you're also trying to include the forearm in what you're saying, right? So with the upper limb, there are 3 bones, not talking about the wrist and the hand just yet. The first one that's most important that we've a little bit talked about is the humerus. That's the largest and longest bone of the upper limb. You have the head of the humerus, and that's what fits into the glenoid cavity on the scapula. You have the anatomical neck. That's a slight constriction right below that, so you can see that. All right, that's where the anatomical neck is. You have the greater tubercle, which is the more lateral aspect here. It's kind of this bump here. Then you have a little sulcus there that we're not too fussed about, and the lesser tubercle is medial to that on the anterior side. You also have the surgical neck, which is right here. That differs from the anatomical neck because the anatomical neck is what we're talking about with like the epiphyseal plates and epiphyseal lines, but the surgical neck is what we mean is that that's the most frequently fractured site on the humerus, so it gets its own name. You see there's a little bit of a rough prominence once you move down the humerus. That's the deltoid tuberosity. That's the attachment site for the deltoid muscle, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next unit. Then as you go all the way down here, you see there's the trochlea. Right here, it's kind of hourglass shaped. That's a condyle, which means knuckle. It looks kind of like a knuckle. And the trochlea is what articulates with the ulna Okay, you see on the back here, we'll talk about it in a second, the olecranon fossa, the olecranon, I've heard either, olecranon or olecranon. Then you also have the capitulum, that is right here, and that's what articulates with the radius. So right here is what articulates with the trochlea, and this articulates with the radius. Caput is head, like per capita, means per head. On either side, you have the epicondyles, which remember epi means upon, and that condyle is knuckle. So on either side, you have condyles. You have on the medial side what we call the medial epicondyle, and then on the other side you have the lateral epicondyle. You can see it a little bit better on this side. Okay. There's a little bit better picture here. So you can see the head of the humerus. That's what articulates with the glenoid on the scapula. And you have the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. The anatomical neck, where that epiphyseal line would be if you were able to cut this open. And the surgical neck, the deltoid tuberosity, which you can see is just a little bump here, and that's where the deltoid attaches on. You have the trochlea, the capitulum, and on either side of that you have the lateral epicondyle and the medial epicondyle. Okay, so now we'll talk about the bones of the forearm. So we have the radius, which that's mostly responsible for like the wrist joint, whereas the ulna, the other one, is mostly responsible for the elbow joint. But the radius mostly forms the wrist joint. It's thin at the proximal end, so you can see it's a little bit thinner here, and it gets a bit wider. You can see that on both of these views here. It's a little bit thinner, and then it gets wider towards the distal end. And this is the same side as your thumb. If you think about taking your radial pulse, that's the one that's on the thumb side of your arm, and that's because it's where the radius is. The radius, right? So you have the head, it's shaped kind of like a nail. Then you have, as you're moving down, the radial tuberosity. That's another part that anchors part of the bicep muscle, or it's the other end of the bicep muscle, anchors onto that. And as you go down, you have the radius, main part of the radius here, and then you have the styloid process of the radius down here at the bottom. You can see that on either end here. Which styloid is referencing like a writing instrument, a pen of some kind, so just like a projection. And that anchors for a handful of ligaments down into the wrist. Then we take a look at the ulna. It's the other part here. And like I said, this forms most of the elbow joint. So you can see it's a bit wider here at the proximal end, and it narrows as you get closer or further away down to the distal end. You've got the olecranon process, or the olecranon, whichever way you want to say it is fine. And the olecranon process and the coronoid process, they form kind of a C, and that's what holds on to the trochlea of the humerus. So the olecranon process, that locks into the olecranon fossa of the humerus, and that's what prevents hyperextension. The coronoid process, that's the other side here, and that grips onto the front end of the trochlea. Right? Then we call the head of the ulna this part down here. Okay, and then the styloid process of the ulna is this right here. And that's, you might notice a little protuberance on your arm, right down at your wrist, and that's the styloid process of the ulna. So let's take a look. So like I said, you've got the radius here. Again, that's the thumb side, so always remember that. Okay. Then you have the ulna. The head of the radius is up here, and the head of the ulna is down here. Both have styloid processes. Right. You have the radial tuberosity, the radius. This is the inner osseous membrane. Inner means between, and osseous means bone. This is the membrane that's between the two bones. You've got the olecranon process, and this is called the trochlear notch. which makes sense because that articulates with the trochlea, and the coronoid process. And that's about all of the parts that you need to have down.